Beautifully done. This theme of civility and civil discourse has recurred throughout the panels, but it really isn't a kind of vague hope that we'll all get along. It's a sort of rigorous notion that, as Mike Bezos just said, constitutional conversations, civil debate is hard work. You have to work to convince people to converge together who aren't used to speaking to each other, and they have to listen to each other. It's important for the left and the right and for libertarians to actually listen closely to what the other side is saying, not to agree, but because it's the conversation itself that binds us as Americans. So our final panel is about a superb topic, and it is where the left and the right agree and disagree about free speech. Please join me in welcoming our panelists. Ladies and gentlemen.
Good to see you, Bill.
We have another Dream Team panel, and let me introduce them briefly. Mark Holden is Senior Vice President and General Counsel of Koch Industries. Greg Lukianoff is the President and CEO of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. Bill Marshall is the Kenan Professor of Law at the University of North Carolina. And Bradley Smith holds the, this is a great title for academics, the 2013 to 2015 Judge John T. Copenhaver Visiting Endowed Chair of Law at the West Virginia University College of Law. What happens in 2016?
We have to order bigger business cards.
Okay, that'll be fine. And he's also on the board of the Center for Competitive Politics. I'm thrilled to announce, ladies and gentlemen, that this panel is co-sponsored by the Federalist Society and the American Constitution Society. And out of all the wonderful things I've had the opportunity to do since coming to the National Constitution Center, bringing these two great organizations together is among the most satisfying. They have joined together because of their love of constitutional debate and dialogue, and also because of the extremely generous support of the Templeton Foundation, which has created a scholarly advisory board called the Coalition of Freedom, co-chaired by Lee Otis from the Federalist Society and Carolyn Fredrickson from the American Constitution Society. And we are co-hosting a series of debates like this, of podcasts and symposia, and we're going to create the best interactive constitution on the web. I'm so excited about this, I have to give a plug for it. We're going to reach out to the top liberal and conservative and libertarian scholars in America to describe for each clause of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights both what they agree about, the settled law and history, and what they disagree about in terms of contemporary issues. And we'll distribute this free to every school kid in America. The College Board is going to work with us to make sure that everyone who takes the AP History and US government exams has access to this incredible document. And for me, it is the living instantiation of exactly what Freedom Day is about, which is the real vital importance of bringing both sides together, not to agree, but to debate the meaning of the Constitution. It's going to be an incredible project. Okay, with that plug, I want to jump right in. Mark Holden, there was a really interesting theme on the last panel of the think tank heads.
First, so I'm sorry.
Sorry?
I didn't know I'd be first.
It's okay. It was a wonderful area of agreement where Anthony Romero from the ACLU and the folks from Cato, Peter Gettler, were all talking about the important work you and Koch have done to support studies of over-incarceration. I want you to tell us about that work, and also, is there a connection between your concern with over-incarceration and your concern about free speech?
Absolutely, and Freda, thanks for inviting me. People were shocked you invited me, but thank you anyway. And there definitely is a connection. And I think Neera Tanden also from the Center for American Progress talked about our work on criminal justice reform. And really, at the end of the day, we're involved in criminal justice reform work, and we have been for many, many years. First off, it's core to Charles Koch's belief in a free and prosperous society. And going back to some of the last panel, which I thought was excellent as well, talking about removing obstacles to opportunity for the disadvantaged, the poor. And if you want to help the poor, as we do, and I think probably everybody in this room does, everybody on this panel does, there's no better way than to reform our criminal justice system, because they are the most adversely impacted by that system that is so broken. So that's one part of it. The other part is we had some negative experiences ourselves with the criminal justice system back in the mid-90s that we learned from. And we wanted to see whatever we learned and how the process went for us If it's happening to a big company with a lot of resources like us, what's happening to the small business owners? What's happening to the average citizen? What's happening to the average Joe in the street out there? And so that got us involved working with the NACDL, National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, and others. And then personally for me, I'm from Worcester, Massachusetts, and I worked in a jail when I was in college. I worked in a jail. I wasn't in jail. I worked in a jail. Let's be clear on that. But when I worked there, it was the best job I had till I went to law school, by the way. It tells you about some of the jobs I had. But I saw many kids I went to school with who weren't the best students, who were poor, who made mistakes, and then ended up in the cycle in criminal justice because they were drug addicts, some of them were mentally ill. That left an impression on me. And so for us at Koch, it's all these things, plus let's get back to why we're all here, the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, the first 10 amendments, all of them. At least 4 of them deal with criminal justice issues. And they deal with between the 4th Amendment, the 5th Amendment, the 6th Amendment, and the 8th Amendment. And then you also, the First Amendment, because if you don't have the First Amendment, the other 9 don't matter. And it's all about free speech, and it's all about our natural rights, and it's all these rights. Our founding fathers may not have got it perfect, but they knew the greatest encroachment to individual liberty and freedom would come through the criminal justice system, and they were right. So that's why we're very proud and happy to partner with Anthony Romero and ACLU, the Center for American Progress, FreedomWorks, you name it, across the board. We'll work with anyone and anybody on these issues.
Beautiful. You have drawn the connection between the First and Fourth Amendments in a way I hadn't thought of, but in fact, you summon us back to history. You can't have the criminal justice system without the First Amendments, and the framers are centrally concerned about the connection between unreasonable searches and seizures, the writs of assistance, and free speech. And Mike Lee, when he came, this was an incredible speech, check it out on YouTube, talked about the main case that inflamed the framers was the case of John Wilkes, who criticized the king, wrote anonymous pamphlets criticizing the king. The king writes a general warrant that doesn't specify the place to be searched or the thing to be seized, identifies Wilkes as the author of this anonymous pamphlet, charges him with seditious libel. Truth is not a defense. The greater the truth, the worse the offense, according to British law. And a jury acquits him, and Lord Camden writes the greatest opinion in colonial history, saying that paper searches of private diaries are offenses both of rights of searches and seizures and also freedom of thought and political dissent. So I had not made that connection. You've now laid the table for what I'm going to ask you, Greg Lukianoff. You've focused more on speech on campus, and we've had a great debate here, one of my favorites last year, tremendous debate about the European and American conceptions of free speech. And I want to set those up in a sec, but just take a beat on what Mark said about the connection between the criminal justice amendments, the Fourth Amendment, and the First Amendment, and to what degree might that inform FIRE's work to stand up for free speech on campus?
Oh, sure. I mean, so I'm the president of FIRE, and we defend free speech and academic freedom on campus, but we also defend due process. And I had someone who honestly I think should have known better. He was a professor at Yale, saying like, why are these things even connected? Why do you do these two completely unrelated things? And it was just a bizarre idea to me. I mean, if you get to the fundamental liberal idea, kind of what Jonathan Rauch talks about when he talks about liberal science, it's all about knowing that you have limitations, that you have biases, that you are not omniscient, and that we need structures that help us deal with these failings. Due process recognizes this, restricting people from censoring recognizes this. It's this great sense of, my one fancy term that I like to use, this great sense of epistemic humility that actually makes all the difference. And I'm afraid that universities are failing to teach a generation that wonderful and important habit.
Bill Marshall, you teach at a university, as I do, as Brad does. Greg has just charged some of our colleagues with failing to take due process into account. What?
I teach too.
You teach too. You're not forced to go to faculty meetings, however. Which is talk about over-incarceration.
Speech at faculty meeting.
Bill, the hate speech debate is hot right now, and liberals are on both sides of it, as we began to tease out in the last panel. Some traditional civil libertarians think that there are due process violations in banning unpopular commencement speakers. Others are more sympathetic to the dignitary rights, to use a phrase that Arthur Brooks talked about, of offended minorities and vulnerable speakers. Which side do you come down on?
I come down more on the freedom of expression side, but I don't do so easily. I mean, I think if you walk into a classroom as a student and you're being subject to all kinds of ridicule because of who you are, or you're being made fun of for who you are, it's hard to participate in that academic climate in the same way you would if you were part of the privileged class that comes in with all the power on your side. So I think a lot of these efforts are really to sort of equalize the learning environment, protect people from hostile environments, which is a very legitimate goal, one that should be followed, because we need to think about the fact that the classroom doesn't affect everybody the same. The workplace doesn't affect everybody the same. And when we see attacks on people's dignity that go on, to use that language from the former panel, it weakens the educational structure, it weakens the work structure, and that's why there are protections against it.
Brad, this word dignity has come up, and there is a great clash between European and American notions of free speech on the one hand and dignity on the other. And the debate is surfacing around an incredible fight over what the Europeans call the right to be forgotten. And this comes from the French droit à l'oubli, the right of oblivion, which is very French. It's sort of right out of Sartre. The French just want to be forgotten. Americans want to be remembered. But the bottom line of this incredibly important right is if you're in Europe, if I'm in Europe, and one of you is tweeting right now during the panel that I'm doing a boring job moderating this panel, I could object that this violated my dignitary rights, and Google and Yahoo would have to decide if I'm a public figure or not, and if they decide I'm not or the tweet is not in the public interest, they'd have to remove it. If they guess wrong, they're liable for up to 2% of their annual income, which was, I think, $50 billion in Google's case last year, so we're talking serious money. Describe this, well, I think I want to ask you this. Who's right, the Americans or the Europeans?
Well, I wouldn't want to betray my country on national television here. I think there are differing approaches to privacy and some of these issues. And, I think one thing that Americans are sometimes forgetting, actually, of late, is that hard-fought right to privacy. So I don't know who's better, but I think there's a balance that needs to be struck, and I think that we may be going in a direction that's further than we would like to go. I see it in the area where I work most often, which is campaign finance. It's interesting. I believe in France. Don't want to be quoted on that, but I believe there's one, and I know in some of the European countries, whereas here we say we need to know who's financing all these ads. There they say, no, you can't disclose who's financing all these ads. It's the exact opposite approach in order to protect the privacy of those who are engaged in political speech, to preserve certain social interactions as well. If we're going to demand to judge everybody on their politics, I think society becomes a very unpleasant place to live. So I think there's much to be said for sort of keeping a greater wall of privacy around what people do and say at any one time. I'm not quite sure that answers your question, but I guess that would be my thinking, is that whichever way is the best, or maybe the Europeans have gone too far, I think we may be in a point now where we've gone overboard in a sort of a, everybody's got to know everything about everyone, and I'm not sure that's healthy either.
Great. Well, you've raised the question of anonymous speech. I want to focus on that in a moment, but first, maybe a response. Greg, I see you itching. Do you want to defend a little bit of American free speech imperialism?
Absolutely. But I also want to say something about the academy, because there is this idea that all of this censorship that takes place on campus, at least it's got done with good intentions. There are very few times when human beings act with a single intention ever, and they're very, very rarely completely commendable or completely pure. And I get the argument, but campuses are trying to make places more welcoming, more inclusive. Okay, so we're just about to file our 10th lawsuit in a free speech litigation campaign, and we're not a litigation organization. And we have dealt with case after case where administrators have told students that they can't, for example, hand out copies of the Constitution in order to honor Constitution Day without getting 2 weeks advance notice from a state employee, from an administrator. We just had a case where an animal rights activist in California, a school controlled by the First Amendment, was told that not only did he have to restrict his protest to a tiny free speech zone that he had to apply for in advance to use, that he had to wear a little tiny free speech badge in order to use it. So definitely I understand the argument that there are good intentions, but sometimes we just can't blindly trust in the good intentions of power.
Bill.
Well, I have to agree, we can't always trust the good intentions of power. On my campus, we have one of our faculty members has written a very number of critical editorials against the governor of our state, and they're trying to take away his center, and they're trying to do whatever they can against him. And that's another example. And that's
the Mike Nichols case.
That's the G. Nickel case. That's another example. I don't think we can say that one side or another has a monopoly on this. The problem about freedom of speech is we all believe in it strongly until it breaks down, and then that Hentoff says it's free speech for me and not for thee. When we really need to be able to apply it across the board. But where I have to disagree with you is that I do not think that college campuses are anything close to bastions of censorship where people are not free to say what they want to say. Certainly in the classes that I have at the University of North Carolina and that my colleagues have and elsewhere, they're open forums and people say all kinds of things, and diversity of opinions are extraordinarily welcome. So there may be a few of these instances, but I don't think they give any sort of sense of the climate on American educational campuses.
Mark, is it your experience that American campuses are incredible, hospitable to diversity of opinion?
Well, no, that's not. That'd be an understatement. Working at Koch, obviously, there is a campaign going on that's run by student groups, so to speak. I'm a bit cynical on it, I must admit. But it's called Unkoch My Campus, and because Charles Koch Institute and Charles Koch Foundation are working with some educational institutions across the country, as they have for many, many, many years, funding free market courses and things on prosperous societies, free and prosperous society, classical liberal type tenets, classical liberalism. And it's led to a lot of FOIA requests and targeting of professors who are teaching courses on free market economics. And they want their private emails, they want to know this, they want to know that. And look, we talk about free speech. I'm pretty much a free speech absolutist in a lot of ways because I think they are natural rights and that really the government can't restrain them because they didn't give them to us. They were the certain unalienable rights we've been hearing about in the Declaration of Independence. And I'm fine with these student groups who are by and large financed by many organizations that oppose Koch politically, and that's their right to do it. Amen, I support it. It's First Amendment. But it's hypocritical when some of these student groups say, well, we're doing it, it's not just because of Koch. We want to point out other big business interests on campus. And there's a lot of groups on the left, a lot of wealthy people on the left that have businesses that are funding university projects and programs. And I don't want them to get attacked at all, but it doesn't seem it's anything but us that's happening. I think it's wrong to attack either side, quite frankly, and I don't think there is a lot of tolerance, at least what I've seen the past few years.
Brad.
If I can chime in briefly, I would be, I guess, more skeptical than Bill. I think that there are things that students know that they are not allowed to say on campus and that they do not say. And as a conservative, libertarian in a law school setting where in some cases I'm almost the only faculty member who would hold those sorts of views, I've become used to over the years a certain ritual, and it usually occurs about midway through the first semester, and there'll be a group of students, and they will appear at my office, 4 or 5, 3 students, something like that. And they'll come in, and it's not quite clear what they want. They kind of talk about class a little bit, and they kind of do this, but they don't have any seeming objective. And then finally somebody will say something like, what did you think about, X, Y, or Z, or whatever? And I'll say, oh, I think that's a load of hogwash. And you can see them go, we thought there was somebody we could talk to. We thought there was somebody on our side. And it starts pouring out the way they feel stifled in class, that certain opinions are not, in fact, allowed to be authored, that they will be ridiculed by their professors, targeted by the professors. And I think it goes into more broadly, well, I think most people and most professors on campuses are very good and do welcome a diversity of opinion. A few people can really spoil that atmosphere, and I think in too many cases we've given a heckler's veto to people. I think in most of these cases where commencement speakers are run off campus and so on, my guess is most of the students would have been perfectly happy to hear them. And rather a small group, a relatively small group, is allowed to exercise a heckler's veto, and I think we need sometimes some braver administrators, some braver faculty who are going to stand up and say, no, this is a university and you can be exposed to ideas that you don't agree with, even ones from the Kochs.
And I just want to inject a little data in here. The American Association of Colleges and Universities asked 9,000 campus professionals, including professors, If they and they were asked this question: is it safe to hold unpopular points of view on campus? That is an incredibly soft question. Is it merely safe to hold unpopular points of view on this campus? And only 16.7% of university professors strongly agreed with this statement. Jonathan Haidt and Philip Tetlock just came out with a paper where they're talking about how social psychology is being hurt by the lack of intellectual diversity. And Haidt gives an example, being at a conference of social psychologists, asking them to raise their hands about how many of them are conservative. There are about 1,000 people in the room, only 3 of them raised their hand. That's a ratio of about 267 to 1 for when you subtract the other people who raised their hands. And what he realized was, statistically speaking, there are certainly more than just 3 in this room. But the fact that they're afraid to raise their hand speaks volumes.
Bill, what can explain this? You and I, we teach in law schools, and I think those stats seem vaguely right in terms of the fact that conservatives seem to be in a minority on faculties. Why is that?
Well, I could make an easy cut here, but I'm not going to on the basis of why people. But you know, I think part of the answer is people who come into academics do so with a certain sense of idealism that often leads to left of center kind of positions. But just because people might be left of center on particular issues doesn't mean they're intolerant and don't want to hear other ideas. I think that most teachers, the ones that I work with, are aware that the best way to have real conversations in the classroom are to have conversations of the type that we're having here, in which somebody might be outnumbered 3 to 1, but that's okay. You want to stand up for your position? You stand up for your position, and that's a good thing. And you actually learn. I went to a very conservative law school at a very conservative time. I certainly got a lot of grief from certain faculty members on the positions I took, and I think it made me stronger in my ability to be able to articulate my views.
Nicely said. All right, speaking of 3 to 1, the question of anonymous speech has been flagged, and we also have to talk about campaign finance issues which cut in unexpected ways. Anonymous speech, Brad Smith raised it. The framers were obviously centrally concerned about. The main thing that they wanted John Wilkes to be able to have was the ability to write an anonymous pamphlet. The number was number 45, and as Mike Lee said, that number 45 was so galvanizing to the framers that they held parties where people would eat 45 ham sandwiches and drink 45 steins of beer and write 45 on the sides of their taverns. So this was a totemic experience for them. Let's see, Mark. Anonymous campaign speech. Why is it important to be able to give anonymously to political campaigns?
Well, I think it's important because it's consistent with the Bill of Rights and the Constitution, what you were just talking about. I think my point of view is that people should be able to give money anonymously or on the record. It should be up to them to decide and not for the government to decide. The government, remember the Bill of Rights, I'm going to paraphrase the late, great Justice William Brennan here, which I'm sure he'll be very flattered by. But basically, the Bill of Rights, the framers didn't lay out what our rights were. They made sure that government couldn't infringe upon those rights because they were presumed to be pre-existing. And my point of view is that to the extent people want to disclose, and there are a lot of disclosure laws that are compelled disclosure, and trust me, Bill and I were talking before we got on here, if Charles Koch and David Koch get pretty much credited or blamed, whatever your point of view is, for every single penny that's spent on a conservative or libertarian cause or issue or candidate. So there is no dark money as with regard to the Kochs, in my opinion. But the reality is there's a cost to disclosure. And from a cost-benefit analysis, in my opinion, I don't quite see who really pays attention to this other than activists on each side that want to harass, intimidate, create lists, try to out them. We've seen it over time, and I'm saying both sides do it. I know they do it on our side, against us, excuse me, with the Kochs, and there have been a number of death threats. And I'm not asking for sympathy or empathy, I'm just saying it comes at a cost, and who really benefits from the disclosure? I mean, if you want to, there are going to be ads on TV that talk about more taxes and more regulation. It's probably not something that any of our groups are sponsoring it for Koch. If it's something about less government, that type of thing, maybe it is. I don't quite see the need for all the disclosure laws, quite frankly, other than for people to put together lists and try to intimidate. And I don't think it really brings about a lot of full and fair discussion on and a full discussion on the issues in our country anymore.
I'll ask you this question and then ask it of Greg. Might there be a difference for disclosure like individuals like the Kochs or even advocacy organizations like the NAACP, which the Supreme Court says should be able to have anonymous membership lists, and Exxon? I mean, could that be different for campaigns that you'd want corporations to disclose but not individuals? Yep.
You asking me?
Yeah.
Look, I think that, well, there's a lot of disclosure for campaigns that's compelled if it's a super PAC, obviously, or an independent expenditure and that type of thing. Yeah, the NAACP versus Alabama case, there's another one involving the Socialist Party from several years ago. Yeah, I'm not saying that poor Exxon's going to be retaliated against so they don't have to disclose things. All I'm saying is I don't know where the right line is, what the divide is. What I'm saying is who is really benefiting from disclosure and why are we doing it at this point in time? From my perspective, and I admittedly am inside a bubble working at Koch and seeing it the last 5 years, I don't see it driving a lot of productive behavior. In fact, it's led to death threats, like I said, and non-productive behavior.
Brad, you raised the question of anonymous speech. Are there any conditions under which disclosure in campaigns is appropriate?
Well, I think this is an important point, is that it's not a question of all disclosure or no disclosure. Now, if you ask me, I tend to feel like the government should not force people to disclose facts about themselves without some really powerful reason to do so. And generally, my sort of preferred idealistic position would be, no disclosure. People have a right to be private, and others can evaluate that an anonymity when they think about the speech. But I'm also willing to make compromises because in the real world, other people disagree, and unless we're going to be at each other's throats all the time, we need to find some kind of accommodation. And there's lots of different lines that can be drawn. For example, we talk now, the word is, they say dark money, right? Like nobody knows where it comes from. Well, actually, there's no political ads in the United States that are dark money. They all require it to say somebody paid for it. So what people are really saying when they say, we don't know who paid for this, what they really mean is we don't know as much about who paid for it as we want. It just says it's paid for by the NAACP or by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and we want to know who in particular that is. And then they use this example as groups with more names that don't stand up for anything, again, Americans for Better Things. But you can
the National Constitution says.
Yeah, but you can usually find out, enough about the group. One of the things that cracks me up is, to give one example, is I remember after 2010 when they first started raising this alarm about dark money, and the one I can't tell you how many news stories I read that said, Crossroads GPS, a shadowy dark money group founded by former RNC chairman Ed Gillespie and Bush advisor Karl Rove to elect conservative candidates to Congress. And I'm like, well, if this is a shadowy dark money group, they're not doing a very good job of it, right? You've just told us what's going on. So, and then there are, if I can go on just a bit more, I mean, there are a lot of different options too. Like one proposal that I'm seeing more and more, it's not really taken off and getting enacted into law, but people are seriously pushing it, is that somebody from the organization has to appear on screen. And it usually says exactly who that has to be, the chairman of the organization. And he would have to appear on screen and say, just like all the candidates have to, I'm Brad Smith and I approve this message, right? Is that always a good thing either? That's a different type of disclosure. That person may be particularly homely. Right? People don't like homely people in politics. That's the reality. They react better to good-looking people. It may be the person's of a race. It may be the person is Arabic, and in certain parts of the country, a lot of people might find that they don't like that, right? So I think there's a lot of things like that we need to start being careful of and thinking about. And we've gotten into this argument, are you pro-disclosure or anti-disclosure, rather than thinking about there's lots of different types of disclosure. And even a person like me, who I guess could be said to be anti-disclosure, is willing to live with a lot of disclosure. I mean, I think there are reasons why people want it that are not entirely frivolous, but I think sometimes we're not doing any cost balancing and we're not recognizing that you can draw different lines.
Bill, you've been wonderfully restrained. What do you think about
Barely
disclosure?
restrained, yes. When you see this ad paid for Mothers by Apple Pie, Mothers for Apple Pie, it doesn't really tell you much. But you have to put this in a larger context. I'm glad everybody here is interested in helping the poor. But the poor have very little political influence because they don't give money. And it's very helpful to voters to know who it is they're supporting. And one of the cues on that is who contributes to a particular campaign. The fact is that the presidency, it really doesn't make that much difference. But at the last minute, large amounts of money can be put into low ballot races by groups when nobody knows who they are. And at the last minute, they sway elections because the other side doesn't even have enough money to be able to defend against the attack. So disclosure is really a second best kind of regulation to at least give a little bit of cues so the voters can have some idea why it is that somebody is attacking another candidate or not.
We have to now put on the table the question of Citizens United. We are having a great debate about whether Citizens United was rightly or wrongly decided, co-hosted by the Federalist Society and the Constitution Society in Boston on May 12th. We had a great debate on a similar topic with Intelligence Squared here in Philadelphia, and it's strange bedfellows. So it was Floyd Abrams and Nadine Strossen, two of the great civil libertarians of their time, arguing in favor of the position that corporations have the same First Amendment rights as natural persons, and Zephyr Teachout and Berth Newborn arguing against it. So this is an area where civil libertarians and libertarian conservatives sometimes converge on the pro-corporate speech position. Brad, you really are the world expert on Citizens United. You've seen how it's been extended in Hobby Lobby. You've heard some of the debate today about the way it's corporate speech and religion rights are being extended further still. Did Citizens United go too far, not far enough, or just right?
Well, I don't think it went too far. Let's take it just on its own terms. It's a narrow decision on a particular set of facts. Remember, the position of the U.S. government was that it could ban a documentary movie about a major political candidate during an election year simply because, like every movie you have ever seen in a theater, rent it from Amazon or any place else, right, it had corporate involvement in its production and distribution, right? That idea strikes me as just absurd. And if you want to talk about the radicals on the Supreme Court, I would say it's the 4 members of the court who said, yeah, that's okay. The government can ban a movie like that, a documentary movie about a political candidate, just because a corporation distributed it or helped produce it or something like that. Now, if you take it on a broader sense, though I also think it's right. I mean, corporations do not have, the court doesn't believe that corporations are people in the natural sense, but it's long recognized that corporations have rights because the people who form them have rights. If we were to go back to, think about the 4th, 5th, and 6th Amendments and so on, for example, the government couldn't just go in and seize corporate assets and leave the shareholders with worthless certificates of stock and say, well, it's a corporation, they don't have any rights. No, they have rights because those shareholders have rights. And it's the same thing, I think, with corporate speech. And I also think corporate speech is often very good for an election. Let's say you've got a company and it's out there in some small town in Iowa or something like that, and it wants to say to the people, look, if our governor doesn't take this stimulus money, because he's off on some conservative right-wing principled thing, right? He's like, if we don't take this stimulus money, this company's going under, and you should know that, right? I think that's a good thing for the electorate to know. I think they ought to know that, and I think they ought to hear that from the corporation, not from the CEO of the company or from some individual. So I think both on its particular facts and in the broader sense, Citizens United is probably correct.
Bill, the argument on the other side, you're not a traditional Floyd Abrams civil libertarian, but you do draw a distinction between what the states and the federal government can do to regulate elections. So tell us some of that.
Well, I do think that one of the interesting things that's happened under the name of campaign finance case law is that the states haven't been allowed to experiment. Montana had a really interesting law in place that was there because of the fact that the copper barons took over the government back in the early 20th century, late 19th century. And they had special laws trying to deal with that corruption that took place. And the Supreme Court struck that down under Citizens United without giving the states any ability to sort of experiment to see what might work and what might not work. I mean, part of the issue on corporate speech, and I think there are reasons why you might want to protect it, because speech is speech, and we like to hear speech come into the marketplace. But you also have to remember it's subsidized speech, because the only reason why it exists is because the state has allowed the corporation to come together and get all kinds of protections, which allows it to amass the kind of wealth that it can then use to try to influence the political process. And the theory that I just gave you, by the way, on corporate power comes from no other radical than Justice William Rehnquist, who took exactly that position of why he did not want to protect corporate speech in the Bilotti case.
Mark, did Citizens United make a difference in the way that you're able to give to campaigns?
Citizens United, as Brad pointed out, dealt with independent expenditures, and we do very little of that, so no. But, I mean, to me personally, I don't think that the government should be saying who can speak and who can't. even in a political season. There is a lot of disclosure that goes with that. I think that, from our perspective, the more voices that are out there, the better. And, this whole notion that people are going to be persuaded by an ad or this or that. Look, I live in Wichita, Kansas. I grew up in Worcester, Mass., which are two kind of normal places, not like D.C. or New York or anywhere. No offense to people from D.C. and New York.
That's the entire audience.
Yeah. Sorry. That's me winning friends everywhere. But I think that most people make up decisions based on, factors peculiar and personal to them. Whether they're swayed or not by ads, I don't know. I know I was in Kansas. We had the first competitive governor and senator race in the 20 years that I've lived there, and I couldn't watch any of the ads by the end. I think that people aren't as swayed by it. I think that, the whole idea that someone's going to change their mind about an issue they feel strong about just because someone runs an ad or that type of thing, or I think that's overplayed. So the Citizens United case, to me, I'm where Brad is on it, and I think it's fine. I think both sides spend a lot of money on ads, and last cycle the Republicans won, the cycle before that the Democrats won, and then vice versa. I don't know how much of an impact it has.
Bill, one last thought on Citizens
I
United?
just want to know why so many corporations are giving money for ads then if it's not working. There are a lot of shareholder lawsuits that should be brought against them.
No, well, I think they're giving it so their voice can be heard in the marketplace of ideas. And I think, like I said, both sides do it. Whether they're effective or not, who knows? I think the people who run on their records and these candidates who were elected in 2014 that flipped the Senate, they'll be up in 6 years and there'll be a whole new slate of ads. I think people vote on issues peculiar to them, and both sides run a lot of ads, and that's kind of how it is for whatever reason.
There is pretty good data that higher spending on ads does inform the public. A lot of people say, these ads are worthless, you don't learn anything. But the public votes, by and large, on fairly basic information. There's pretty good evidence that repetition, that's the hallmark of learning, right? You say the same thing over and over. You repeat yourself. You're redundant. You'll all remember that tonight, right? That's how you get through. And it does help voters to locate candidates on the political spectrum, identify them with issues. So I think that in a sense, both Mark and Bill are right. The ads, they're not going to change the minds of people who have strong perceptions on views, and they probably won't change them generally, but they may inform voters of where a candidate is on a particular issue, and that's a good thing.
So one last set of questions and then closing statements. Our job, according to Freda, and we're going to do our homework, is to figure out what we've talked a bit about what the left and the right disagree about. I want to hone in on what the left and the right agree about free speech. As in the Fourth Amendment area, we have a series of unanimous or nearly unanimous opinions that have been uniting justices of very different perspectives, but they involve rather jarring facts. 8 out of 9 justices protected the right of people to film violent crush videos. A similarly lopsided majority struck down California's desire to regulate violent video games. A similar majority said that very hurtful protests at funerals, military funerals, saying terrible things about gays and lesbians were okay. Is the entire panel celebratory, obviously not of the results in these cases, but of the principle in these cases that we have to protect the speech we hate the most? Or does anyone think the Supreme Court has gone too far? And I'll just start with you, Mark.
No, I obviously, hate speech, no one's a fan of that. That's reasonable or rational. But when you frame it that way and you look at how big the First Amendment has been seen and the types of things that it allows for between Nazi marches through Skokie, Illinois, flag burning, animal abuse videos, that type of thing, I think that while that's repugnant, repellent, and no honest, decent person would be in favor of that, it is protected by the First Amendment, which kind of underscores, not to bring up Citizens United again, why everybody gets so exercised over that. And in some ways, they're saying that maybe flag burning is more appropriate than running ads. But I think that they got it right. I think that the First Amendment is big and broad, and it's an important part. As I started talking about, all our rights are hinged on that. And that's why it's number one, the First Amendment, and everything else, including all the ones dealing with criminal justice reform issues and criminal justice issues, all flow from that.
One footnote, I hope it's not pedantic. This is a plug for our Bill of Rights, but go look at the original copy of the Bill of Rights. Our First Amendment was not their first, it was their third. The original First Amendment said that there has to be one representative in Congress for every 50,000 inhabitants. If it had passed, there'd be 20,000 Congress people today, just as well that that one didn't pass. So it's sort of a coincidence that our first is first, but it's undoubtedly most important from the framers' natural rights philosophy, which we've talked about a lot. Greg, I presume you think that Justice Alito was wrong to dissent in those cases.
I certainly do, and one of my beloved former summer interns was actually interning for Alito at the time. He was clerking for Alito at the time that he wrote that opinion, and we were like, how could you? But when it comes to offensive speech, I think that we're thinking about it wrong, and I think we're at a major sort of a point of divergence between what the law says and what the cultural attitudes are becoming. I think the First Amendment ability to protect offensive speech, which I think is essential to protecting speech at all, is alive and well and thriving in Supreme Court law. I think culturally, though, our understanding of free speech has diminished a great deal. The idea of hearing people out, the idea of giving benefit of the doubt, the idea of not forming Twitter mobs about anybody who makes a misstatement. So I wrote this book called Freedom from Speech that came out this past fall because I'm concerned about we need to go beyond explaining that I end up hearing even First Amendment lawyers make this argument that essentially sounds like the First Amendment is good because the First Amendment protects it. It's like, no, we can't have that circular argument. And I think the most important thing that we miss, because we've gotten very much into sort of normative judgments of whether or not speech is high value or low value, but what we seem to be consistently missing is that there's a real value to know what people think, not even if, but especially if it's horrible. This is a brave and very scientific method kind of way of looking at the world, but it's being currently, by people who will make references to dignity and that kind of stuff, being ignored. And it's not about we're saying that what Fred Phelps says is good. It's just valuable to know what Fred Phelps actually thinks.
Bill, just maybe stand up for Justice Alito, a great friend of the Constitution Center who argued for dignity in these cases and said that the feelings of the families at the funeral should be respected.
Sorry, can't go there. I do think that one of the things that brings the left and right together is the celebration of the First Amendment and the idea that we can be offended. Now, when it turns out when we get offended, then we want to shut down the speech, but at least in the abstract, we all think that this is our first freedom, even though it is the third, as you point out. And I do think that allows reprehensible speech as well as the kind that we like.
Great. Brad, you want to make it unanimous on this question?
Pretty much. I mean, I'm very sympathetic with Justice Alito and other occasional dissenters in those opinions. Those cases, in a way, don't interest me that much because they are rare and they are at the extreme. And I think, as Mark and Greg have sort of hinted, I mean, the typical argument is we need to protect that. We need to protect pornography. We need to protect this kind of, hateful speech in order to preserve the core of the First Amendment. And what strikes me as odd is that the core of the First Amendment is where the court seems to be giving the least protection, and that is people talking about politics. And that just seems to me to be downright backwards, that you get more protection if you want to have one of these foul demonstrations at the funeral of a serviceman than if you, as Mark says, want to run some ads saying my opponent's a jerk and he's going to raise your taxes. And so that discourages me. But I will say, as a point of agreement, one thing I think that comes out is that actually there is very strong agreement, I think, among us, and I think as representatives of sort of different points of view, on a robust First Amendment. As you point out, most of these decisions were, lopsided majorities, and there's a couple of issues, campaign finance, maybe to some extent hate speech and so on, that are divisive. But for the most part, I do get some comfort that Americans are still pretty good on the question of freedom of speech.
Beautiful. There was a fine bit of agreement there, and now it's time for closing statements. In the spirit of our think tank panel, I'm going to ask each of you crisply to identify the aspect of freedom of speech you think most important facing the country, and what will you and or your organizations do to promote it over the next year. And we're going to go in reverse order. Brad.
Okay, well, I do think that the core issue is that issue of political speech, which I think has been under attack for a long time, and I think it's under attack. And both sides do it. Whoever seems to be losing or winning, I guess you could look at it, attacks the other side and tries to shut off their speech, tries to keep them from speaking. So in the 50s, you had teachers who were being asked to report what books they read, right, and things like that. And now it seems like the challenges come from the left, which want to attack political speech, force people to disclose themselves so they can be subject to ridicule and so on. And I think that is a major problem. I think we have to get over the idea that the First Amendment is this kind of bizarre libertarian barrier to badly needed campaign reform. I think it is what the founders thought was the way you assured that government was clean, that government corruption was exposed, and that elections were fair and open. And at the Center for Competitive Politics, we fight on that through litigation and through trying to educate people about the way money actually works in politics and to get people thinking about what the alternative really would be if we gave government a blank check to regulate speech.
Great. Bill.
I got to agree with Brad that it's political speech, but I think it's a much more complex issue than he does, because one of the questions about freedom of speech is it a value in and of itself, or is it there because it's designed to promote democratic decision-making? And depending on how you view on that, you might come out to different kinds of results on some of these campaign finance cases, because there's something matter with a system where the first thing you ask about a candidate is how much money can she raise? And a system in which somebody has to sit in a room for 20 hours a day dialing for dollars in order to be able to be competitive, or a system in which poor people do not really have any access to the decisions that are being made. That's troublesome. It's troublesome also for government to do any regulation. I got to agree with that. So you have a deep conflict going on there, but it's not an easy result on either side. And the first thing I tell my First Amendment students is, if you think this is an easy decision on either side, rethink it. So I think one of the things the American Constitution society is supposed to do, and is doing, and what this organization is doing, is to get us to do what Greg said we should do, which is sit down and really listen to each other and talk to each other and figure out what it is that we're trying to accomplish so we become a little bit more sensical on some of these issues.
Well said. Greg.
Thank you. You asked for some American free speech imperialism early, and it wasn't quite time for that yet. But for closing statement, I do want to say this, and it's something that I take very seriously, and I think that we feel very proud and confident on this panel that free speech and the First Amendment will be well protected, but I think to a degree we're sort of kidding ourselves. Free speech is in trouble in the rest of the world. I mean, we just had an article by Gary Trudeau showing sympathy for what amounts to essentially blasphemy laws. And I don't care, there's no argument that you could have an international blasphemy law regime and still have freedom of speech. I think there's a serious threat from hate speech laws. I think most countries, or most of the rest of the world has national security laws that we would find terrifying to a degree. And I do get a little bit, I think to a degree, the First Amendment won't mean nearly as much. I think the right to be forgotten is disastrous potentially. And I think unless we're actually making strong moral, philosophical, and practical arguments about free speech that apply not just under the American First Amendment, but understanding free speech as an international human right, it's not going to survive very long in the U.S. So in this way, I'm arguing, and we're nowhere near this, but I'm arguing for a global First Amendment. I think it should be protected to be an oddball anywhere in the world, to believe what you want anywhere in the world.
Thank you for that. Mark Holden.
Well, I agree with that, but I don't know global First Amendment, but I agree with the sentiments for sure. Here's where I am on it, and picking up on what Bill said. We heard the last panel talking about the criminal justice reform area and how that's brought a lot of different groups together that you wouldn't think could be in the same room, and it has. At Koch, we'd like to find more of those issues. I don't know if they're out there or not. We'd like to think they are. We'd like to think we have some good ideas to add to the discussion. And so we'd like to use our First Amendment rights as individuals and then as a corporation to have a dialogue across the aisle with other groups about issues of common interest. And there's a lot of them out there. Criminal justice reform is one, but if you look at that issue, it's the tail end of the problem. We're talking about economic opportunity, that's a big issue. We need to talk about our education system, those types of things, and we have ideas. We know our friends on the other side have ideas. We'd like to have a discussion around that instead of everybody going to their corners, throwing names around, running ads, and fundraising off each other. So that's how we'd like to use our First Amendment rights in the coming year, at least till it's 2016, and I guess everybody goes back to their corners. But thank you.
What an exhilarating discussion. We have disagreed about aspects of the application of First Amendment principles to situations from campaign finance to the regulation of political speech, but agreed about hate speech and the centrality of the American tradition. And both Mark and Bill talked so movingly about something we've seen throughout this day, which is that there is a real value simply to bringing people who disagree fundamentally together, as all of us in this audience and on this stage are, listening respectfully to each other so that we can identify areas of agreement and disagreement. Your job now, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, is to go and have a drink, which you've earned after this great discussion, but also to answer the question that I just raised to each of the panelists and think about what each of you will do over the next year to celebrate freedom, to participate in debates about it, and to encourage other Americans to do the same. And this is fundamentally about self-education. Educate yourself. You have to learn enough about the arguments on all sides of these complicated debates so that you can make informed decisions. And that requires reading up on the history of the Constitution and the paradigmatic cases that gave rise to it, learning about the arguments, the constitutional and other arguments on both sides, and not assuming that either is right in advance, and ultimately realizing that this one document is the thing that binds us. We disagree about so much in this room, but all of us agree about the centrality, beauty, and power of this greatest document of human freedom in history, the US Constitution. Thank you to Freda Levy. I want to bring her back up to the stage after an incredible day for making this remarkable conversation possible, and give her and our panelists a round of applause. Hooray for freedom!